that's sort of the point of streaming versus recording the formal podcast, is we kind of want to keep it a bit loose and open it up for some discussion and some topics. So if you are signed up on Twitch, the chat should be open. Hopefully I said it right. And you can send us things. You can send us suggestions for what to talk about. And yeah, I don't know if we're totally certain how long we're going to do it. Maybe like an hour, 2 hours, something like that. And yeah, just kind of sort of live react, take it as it is. Just kind of go through some topics that we've been thinking about. And it's kind of less, the episodes are a little more produced. We do a lot of research up front. This, we're kind of like, okay, what's our immediate thought? Can we say anything interesting?
Show you our thought process.
Yeah, hopefully. Whether that's good or bad.
Might even be better than the episodes.
It very well could be. It'll definitely be a lot more conversational. And yeah, let us know if the audio is good. I mean, the only thing you should be hearing right now is our voices. I will be playing, probably we'll be watching some videos or clips of videos shortly. So yeah.
I think we may or may not be having some audio issues.
Are we having some audio issues? Can no one hear us?
Someone has reported that they cannot hear us.
Okay, give me a sec. Oh, I know exactly why that is. Okay. How about now? You should be able to hear us now. It might take a minute for the stream to catch up.
Yes, yep. We are live.
Okay.
Now
amazing.
We are live.
Okay, amazing. Thank you. Okay. Well, if you missed the first 4 minutes, we didn't really say anything interesting. We had the audio set incorrectly. But basically, if you've seen the podcast, it's a little bit more produced and researched and edited. This is going to be a little bit more live. So the only thing for anyone watching, first of all, thank you. And secondly, yeah, like we're going to talk about some topics that we have just kind of spoken about a little bit. They're not really pre-prepared, but if there's anything that you want us to speak about, if there's anything you find interesting, feel free to put it in the chat, and hopefully we'll give our take on it, and kind of just go through it. This is meant to be a little bit more conversational than the podcast, and we're just kind of go through some things that we've seen in the news, some things that we're thinking about. And yeah, it just seems like live streaming is like a better way to actually connect with people, kind of listen to the podcast a bit in a vacuum while you're doing your chores or going to the gym or whatever. But this is more interactive. Hopefully people can actually, send us some stuff, send us their thoughts. We'd love to know what you're thinking about what we're saying or what you're seeing on stream or anything like that. So that's basically it. I don't know. What did you want to get to first? We can watch something.
I wanted to talk about Zohran Mamdani.
Okay, let's do it.
What is he running for? Is he running for mayor of New York City or
mayor of New York? I believe. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, I don't think he'd be anything else.
Yeah.
No, exactly. It's anyway. The Progressive International just came out with a post.
Okay.
For those of you who don't know the Progressive International, you can check them out. They're quite interesting. Sort of leftist, progressive group that tries to bring together international voices. But they posted, I think rather funnily, without a sense of irony, unfortunately, quote,
sure.
Economists unite in support of Zohran Mamdani. Exactly.
Okay.
Plans for New York City.
Yeah.
But, so they'll say something like, Zohran Mamdani's campaign featuring rent stabilization, fair free transit, universal no-cost childcare, and municipal groceries, offers immediate relief while addressing NYC's affordability crisis.
Okay.
So it's unclear whether this is a kind of temporary measure. To me, it sounds like, it sounds like a kind of, if economists are supporting this, I think people should run the other way.
Sure.
That's my immediate intuition.
Totally.
But to be serious for a little moment, I think that issues like this, like ways of organizing economics in this way, treating economics like it's this kind of external science, sort of like going to the doctor, and you get certain pills to take or certain exercise regimes.
Yeah.
But the idea that the doctor and the doctor's advice are somehow independent from the body. This is not the case in economics. It's sort of like when Yanis Varoufakis says that, economics would be like if when you gave a weather report, it also changed the weather.
Right.
So not only is there kind of a missing bit of neutrality, but I suppose the best way to explain it is that yesterday I was looking at my my milk for my cereal, and they'll say things like, "Oh, the shipping of this milk has been offset, carbon offset."
Right.
And here's the idea being is some guy has gone and like planted a bunch of trees to offset, the carton, the materials, or again the shipping, some input into the production of that carton. But here's what's sort of missed by this way of thinking, and it is a form of economics, is, well, but it takes energy for that guy, to drive his truck. Wages have to be paid to him, right? So I can carbon offset anything. It does, but there are these kinds of, there are energy costs that make it so that unless you're factoring in those energy costs, what difference does it make?
Yeah.
And I think that in economics, you get these kinds of circles, and wages is a really good example of it. Like, is that, well, as long as money is flowing, right? This is basically Keynesian economics. As long as money is flowing, everything's like fine.
Yeah.
Because, to a degree, it doesn't entirely matter what you're spending money on. As long as it's sort of generally productive, as long as it involves people getting paid, people will then spend that money. The money spent in certain places will then reinforce the other sides of society, and the money cycle will regenerate and cycle through.
Sure.
Beyond, now many people disagree with this view, especially in the modern era, and especially since the 1970s. But there are lots of reasons why this narrative has become ideologically distorted, and the conservative critique of this sort of cycling through is not particularly at issue here. But when you look at Zohran's campaign, I mean, one basically just sees like a bunch of similar things of a kind of like, well, as long as we can keep moving money.
Yeah.
But in this case, it's sort of like, well, we're going to find money somehow for rent stabilization, fare free transit, universal no cost. Like, but where the heck is the money coming from? But I'm not asking this as a conservative. I'm sort of asking myself, like, okay, this sounds like one of those things where, well, the economics supports it because everyone believes in this thing called aggregate demand. Because it's very fashionable to be a Keynesian now, to say, well, the money supply will just, as long as it continues to regenerate and we choose the right projects, to a degree,
right?
Then we get effectively what I'm saying is you get the political equivalent of a carton of sort of recyclable milk,
right?
Yeah.
Well, so so I mean, I guess part of this is that we're not really addressing what seems to be, there was like a change, I think, recently from, you see this in what we can call maybe woke in general, which was that there was an element of like racism is this interpersonal thing that needs to be solved, or at least there was a view of that, of it's like me being racist to you based on, or whatever. And then it moved from that to we need to address more systemic, more stabilized, larger superstructure elements, right? Hiring and whatever. This is where you see the rise of DEI and all these things. And sometimes with this stuff, it feels like this is our economic version of an interpersonal issues, which is like, you and I cannot afford public transit, and we need to make public transit cheaper. We need to subsidize public transit. And what we're not fundamentally tackling is not only, well, what makes it unaffordable, but why even does something like being able to move from one end of my city to the other efficiently through public means require market or require an exchange of money in this way?
I don't think we really have like a very coherent way of getting you from one side of the city to the other, which is why this kind of economics for me is sort of kind of brainless, even though everyone loves it and progressives love it. I mean, and even like someone like Varoufakis kind of likes it. He's like, oh, exactly. You see there, right up there. And the anti-austerity, rejects austerity.
Right.
The idea being, actually, if you invest in your community, if you invest in your country, if you invest in infrastructure, what progressive economics says is you get it all back in kind. And what I think is that, but economics doesn't actually answer anything. It doesn't answer that problem of how do I get from one side of my city to the other. So therefore, in order for me to agree with this, I just have to assume that we have all of these solutions already. We've already made them all.
Right.
All the design solutions, all the infrastructure solutions. We've come up with all the politics. It's just a monetary problem.
Right.
Oh, trust me. If you get to the point where you think you just have a monetary problem, probably it's the exact opposite. Money's the one thing you have in crazy supply, right? And everything else you treat like a kind of interruption, or it basically that's where your disaster is.
Right.
You've not kind of figured out, like money's not the problem anymore. And yeah, I think you see that with definitely if you're not addressing affordability, like you said, because can you address affordability with economics? We assume affordability is like an economic term. I'm not sure it actually is. I think it's a much broader term than just an economic term.
Right. Well, what do we think about this? He proposes city-owned grocery stores, a quote, public option, which we hear a lot, utilizing economies of scale to supply healthy food at affordable rates. These municipal grocers would sell staples at wholesale prices, leveraging public purchasing power and economies of scale. So this, I think, gets us back to aggregate demand. Immediate relief from price gouging. So like this is another thing too, which is like, there's just a moral issue where grocers are so greedy that they're like, they're just screwing people over, and grocery prices cost more than ever, which is partially true. I mean, we live in Canada where we had the bread price fixing scandal, and we often have these people will say, grocery store only operates on a 3% profit margin or whatever.
It's true.
Which is true.
It is true.
But yet, most of the people who own grocery chains here are billionaires. So it doesn't seem that concerning.
Well, there's a cartel in Canada which helps,
right,
sort of, to give the illusion of wealth.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that definitely you're right about them turning into a moral issue. It's sort of like after 2008, we thought, okay, if we just do a fraud, then it'll be fixed. We just regulate things. Not that we did that, right. But since 2020, people have argued, again, Varoufakis mainly, almost exclusively sometimes, is that no, it's not fraud anymore. There were those bank closures in like 2023 in the United States, and it's endemic to the system now that it can't survive without basically enormous amounts of stimulus spending like we had in 2008. So, in other words, it's not a moral problem. There's something wrong with the economics itself. And so when you look at food, when you look at a grocery store, you just go just by the original paragraph, and you get the problem is that there's something. They think that there's the economics can be better if we do this leveraging public purchasing power and economies of scale thing. But one can approach this issue from so many different angles. But like one is food and the concept of food that we have over-determined by economics, so that if you have a problem in economics like we've had since 2008 in the present form, or really a lot longer, will you find that, okay, there are no naive variables here, right? In terms of like, okay, food just, again, exists over there, right? This is always going to be the assumption that you have that economics is like any other science, that there's this gap. Yeah. When you go to the doctor's office, they just give you the prescriptions, and nothing about the doctor's position, nothing about the prescriptions themselves, the way they tell you them, affects your illness. Of course, the funny thing is this is not even true in physiology. Right. But if you just go like issue by issue, food is not just going to figure itself out if the economics behind it is rotten. Because food itself is overdetermined by the way that we organize yields and productivity, and and choose to design our food systems. And then when you treat it as a problem of economics, though, but not as a problem that the underlying economics are broken, but say, no, we just haven't had progressive enough economics in New York City, and that's why we have food deserts. Yeah. I think you missed this crazy opportunity to say, what about if we didn't use economics to solve this problem? Do we even have the option to? Right. For many people, it just sounds like intellectually incoherent to suggest that we wouldn't use it to solve these problems. But I can assure you, once you get into the details of public purchasing power and economies of scale, all you see is extreme monetary economics, right, which we shouldn't be afraid of because, we're libertarians and we're afraid of the state. That's a different issue. But because we're afraid of the fact that our notions of the public, our notions of municipality, even our notions of grocery stores and our food system generally rely upon a form of monetary economics that, had its truth revealed to us in 2008, really a long time ago, maybe 1929, maybe even sooner. People have been trying to find alternatives to it for centuries, but that's my frustration. You look at the economic data is clear.
Right.
when the public steps in
to correct market failures, consumers benefit. Interesting. I mean, multiple things here. Division of, public sector versus consumers, which you'd imagine. I mean, those are in some cases one and the same. And in fact, this is meant to represent this.
Or in the worst way, the other one grounds the other.
Consumers,
public sector only exists on a base of consumerism.
Right, they exist as consumers, which is the interesting thing, right? They're not it's creators versus consumers, right? Can they think in a way that's not just, well, how do we consume in a better way and all these things, but it's also, the idea that it's like we need to correct these market failures. But markets were meant to be this thing that, is sort of infallible and all these things. So it's like, well, how do we escape a paradigm where there can even be market failures? Where if there's a failure in the market, that means that you end up in a food desert where, people can only shop at the bodega or whatever and eat unhealthy and all these things. Like, what does it mean when your society is set up that market failures can fully determine literally like the composition of your body and the way that you exist and live in your diet.
But the markets aren't even failing though. I mean, what they're failing, there are two senses that they're failing only in the most absolute sense, in that they're not coordinating things anymore. We're not able to build a coherent state anymore.
Right.
And then in the worst sense, they're not failing in that for many people, they're succeeding, but there are no governing social concepts anymore behind markets. I mean, to me, this last sentence is carnism. We talk about it all the time, totally. Right? I mean, he has a really sort of slightly wacky plan. Again, when you look at the rhetoric on its own, but you can see how it's based upon this idea. I mean, if you go down the list of economists who support this, I mean, these are like very big people.
I know.
Just the first three alone.
This is crazy.
Well, yeah, sure. We've got the old guy, Galbraith, but you've got Isabella Weber. I mean, she wrote a brilliant book on China for her. It was like part of her doctoral work. And Weber started with Adam Tooze. They started a publication in Germany called Surplus. Yeah. Which is like, if there's ever a publication that I would love to go sort of line by line, because it's the ultimate example of a publication that wants to convince us that progressive economics is possible. That it's just a question of reimagining the models, reimagining how we describe variables. Sure, we don't. Libertarian economics is a political critique, right? Not a substantive economic alternative, which is true. Doesn't make what you're saying anymore, right? I mean, the third guy too is, and that's, if I'm not mistaken, Ha-Jung Chang is, of course, the guy who has written extensively about, God, what did he write again? He's written extensively about how capitalism is a sort of manipulation, and he writes about 19th century. Look him up. You'll recognize him. He does videos with Penguin Random House, and he's huge.
Huge. Sure. Yeah, totally.
What's his big book again?
23 Things They Don't Tell You?
Exactly.
About capitalism? I think I do know this
and
one.
Gary, the tax guy, or the trader, had him on as his favorite economist. Like,
right.
This is the coalition we're trying to build here. Go to Surplus. It's all in German, so maybe not. But it's just.
We can translate it. We could always translate it.
It's not the coalition for me. Let's see who else is worth. Probably, I assume, Mazzucato will be on there, the Italian moonshotter.
Giannis.
I'm not. Giannis will always support this kind of stuff because he wants us to be spending on more meaningful things. Yeah. Which, and if I ever get to, there's Ann Pettifer as well, who wrote that book, The Case for the New Deal.
Oh yeah.
If I ever get to meet Yanis Varoufakis, I would like to ask him, but, is there any form of kind of, anyway, interesting. We've got brain rot economist, burnout society. That was
wrong one. That's fine.
Yeah, that's Han.
Okay.
Hello, brain rot.
Hey.
Who are you? I wonder. I have no idea who that is.
There was just one thing I wanted to end on a little bit, which was that we spoke about this briefly, or we alluded to it, was market, to correct market failures. Is that in many ways, the way that New York is set up. So if you've ever been there, it's true. You can't find a grocery store first of all, New York is massive. It's unbelievable. You can walk for two hours and you're in the same neighborhood. And what will happen is there is literally no real grocery store. And sometimes there's little, what we would call in Quebec, fruiteries and things like that. And the bodegas in some ways turn themselves into little actual grocery stores. But part of that is in fact not a market failure. It makes perfect sense that somewhere like that, you couldn't have a huge, a big box store. There's no room for a tractor trailer to bring in, crate loads of vegetables and fruits and things. There's just literally no, when you turn towards Aiden, the directional microphone drops you. Okay. Thank you. Good note. Like New York City is not built for this practically or economically, for like a real, what we would call like a real grocery store, to avoid these food deserts.
To which the response would be, I mean, are grocery stores the be all and end all for food design?
Well, my thing is to get back to Carney, when he talks about moral versus market sentiments, it's like, how do you tell a market that no one wants no one wants junk food, or no one wants bodegas, or no one wants...
I don't think the idea is not can you or can you not tell markets things. I think you can't. Mm-hmm. I think that's basically the assumption of Carney, is you cannot, but you live in a market society. So you need to maybe transition to a different kind of society that has markets. Right. Again, or Varoufakis's, markets without capitalism. Mm-hmm. But the problem for me is that whatever if you try and have, it might just be that markets are working, which is why they can't coordinate anything anymore.
Right.
And that doesn't mean that they're just coordinating for obscene corporate profits. That's not really the point anymore. It just might. I think we've reached a certain reflexive limit in terms of what markets can help us design. I think a lot of the content of markets and market society, in terms of like historical change, right? We like to use the word growth nowadays, but I'll use the phrase historical change, is that creating markets was such an occupation for hundreds of years, expanding them, coming up with the political philosophies to accompany them in the liberal revolutions, and then later in the age of revolutions in the middle of the 19th century. And then 100 years later, when the unions, gave us the weekend. Right. We've had a series of rather brilliant, in some respects, historical negotiations. But I think that once you reach the point where markets are no longer providing a significant, I think, enough social struggles in the construction of a market society, right? Unions still believe in markets. Right. Liberal political philosophers still believe in the basis of a free trade, of commercial society, et cetera, et cetera. I could give 1,000 other examples. I don't think we're there anymore. What's scary is that progressives cannot come up with it's not even that they can't come up with interesting proposals. It's that their proposals don't involve a society that I find in any way recognizable. Right. There is no version of this which I think will actually come into existence. Whereas I can sort of see, okay, maybe we get the weekend and we end, child labor, right, 12-year-olds working for 15, 16 hours a day. I can see how maybe, just maybe, that could work temporarily. Of course, there were people at the time who said it's not even going to work temporarily, but it certainly won't work in the long term. Right. And so, if you address the grocery store issue in New York City, it's like, well, the city is not built for grocery stores. I'm not sure what it's built for. I mean, it was an old Dutch colony built for trade, and you know what I mean, and whatever it's become since then. The question is, are we allowed to change it? Could we even conceive coming up with another Dutch colony where we then, 300 years later, it's the most important city on earth, apparently? Right. Do we even have the concept, even in our most progressive accounts? Do we have the right to design anything, to redesign the grocery store? Again, we submit our proposals to markets, so they go through commerce, which is really the bad end of this big historical change I think we've been in for 500 years. Right. It was fun to set up markets, but now that we actually have to perform for them, the markets have no idea what we want. We were always telling markets what we wanted by constructing, generation after generation, a coherent market society. But we're not doing that anymore. And it does surprise me that all these economists are not willing to think anything new beyond economics. Yeah.
I think we should address this chat from Helena. What would you say to people who think that we need these measures as an urgent relief, so to speak, going back to your doctor example? What if we need these to recover from a societal / economic, quote unquote, heart attack, to quote unquote, get back on our feet? before we can address bigger issues. See the use of words like immediate relief in the article.
Well, I don't think so.
Okay.
Because I actually think there's a physiology as well. Sorry, the doctor caused the heart attack. The advice you're getting is bad advice.
Right.
Trying to reformulate. Again, I almost can't emphasize this enough. The worst kind of economics we could use right now is progressive economics. Because it's economics that really believes economics works. I'd much prefer a shameless libertarian economist who's just using it as a total political instrument. But this idea that it really works, again, that you can get this split, that no, the doctor's just giving us good advice, we've just been too stupid to implement it.
Right.
You know?
Well, that's the sort of thing that says it pairs immediate relief with structural problem solving. But of course it seems to solve the problems that the structure itself caused, which means that it's not actually solving them.
You can't.
Right.
You're just kind of, I mean, again, like a rent freeze together with long-term commitments to building at least 200,000 additional rent-stabilizing public units. Look, I would love to sit in the committee that decides what those houses and public units are going to look like. I would love to be part, whatever, of the politics that would go about organizing this. But it gets back to my original critique, which was that again, Keynesianism convinces us that as long as money continues to move, we can have progressive investment, we can have progressive policy, and everything can work. Money is not important. Money is just a reflexive category. And I mean, Keynes' famous phrase was, if we can do it, we can afford it. And that was his concept. And I think to an extent, that was a really, really interesting response to the 1930s and the 1940s, and out of which we built many global institutions. And then that all collapsed in 1971. And it was interesting, the thinking that he was doing. And I think that there is something true to if we can afford it, we can do it, which has, I think, sort of very little to do with economics. That has to do with human beings. That has to do with freedom. But when you reach a point where the monster you've created kind of is bigger than the maker, right? This kind of Promethean problem, let's call it. So we've created money, and actually, it's not just innocent, and it sort of returns to us certain things we didn't expect. I think there are a lot of unexpected variables that are being returned to us that no economics is going to be able to turn into a science. And it gets back to this point about the carton of milk, because what about the extra energy that I put in to make it into a carbon neutral product? That energy, both literally and that materially, we don't think about energy much at all. We just think about economic variables,
right? Or
we pretend we can treat energy as an economic variable, isn't included. But on top of that, you have you just get a version of kind of the cyclical economics, or in these kinds of progressive Keynesian political platforms, where we think that it's just been a lack of money that we've given to people. And again, they know what is the idea here? They know what to do with the money.
Right. And
if only it would cycle through the proper system as opposed to the stock market. Again, this kind of Paul Krugman-esque economics, I honestly think it's a BS. I really do. I think it's the worst in that it presents itself as the progressive alternative.
Totally. Not addressing any of the fundamental kind of structure behind it. Brain rot economist. I'm surprised to see economists endorsing a 4-year rent freeze. Almost shocked. How do you feel about it?
I'm not surprised. I think all these progressive economists are desperate to save the system right now. I think they want to get rid of any kind of practices that they see as kind of over-commercialized practices, hyper-commercial practices. They think, again, that will solve it. It won't.
Yeah.
We'll just create it. We can't, I don't think you can add controls to the system. We're not building highways, and it's the 1930s, and the Great Depression just happened, and World War II is about to happen. We're not going to get this older form of economics back. I really don't think we're going to get it back.
Well, it's honestly, sometimes it's as simple as if you have a society that's built upon, do we need to put in controls that prevent people from overcharging other people for housing? And your solution is, well, we can stop it for 4 years while we figure out something.
No alternative to the rent system.
Right, exactly.
Wouldn't the really, beyond economics here, wouldn't the really interesting thing to be okay, can we create a different form of housing than rental-based housing?
Yeah, totally.
I mean, these are some of the questions that we have to start asking.
Right. Well, because that's the thing, is like, let's build 200,000 additional rent stabilized and public units. But clearly, this is an example of rent stabilized and public units are not enough. And even the people in rent stabilized and public units are getting priced out, and it's shitty.
Because the variables that are being used to build these policies are not considered problematic in and of themselves.
Right.
The only thing that this program addresses from the Progressive International or from Zohran is there are people on the other side of the political spectrum who say we can't afford these things. Well, actually, we can afford them. Mm-hmm. And the truth is, in a scary way, they're kind of right. No, again, back to that Keynesianism. You can kind of afford it because money is just meant to be a cycle. But that's the problem.
Right.
This is the real difference we need to qualify here is between economics says it works and something like... But is it able to explain something like the energy that it takes to make a wage system work? Like, what are the extra social variables that make a wage system work? We can't just say, oh, that's politics.
Yeah.
No, that's called society. Again, back to this assumption about this sort of gap, this sort of distance between, the doctor and the patient. Like, there's this assumption that, no. This is all society, and then economics comes in and gives us the best blueprint. And if we just use that blueprint and get rid of the kind of political manipulations of that blueprint, we'll know exactly what to do with society. But every single word here in these paragraphs, from buses to 30%, in reductions in violence against bus drivers, to the data from the pilot confirm that the fare-free bus model works. Like, do you think that buses just exist without economics?
Right.
Do you think you just have a society of buses and normal commercial society without the prevailing ideological setup that makes that a coherent social reality? So sorry, if your economics no longer works, nothing else does. We don't just have a society waiting in the wings that we can just sort of, continue to rely upon, people ready to go to work. Mm-hmm. Yes, in some 1930s setup when people literally are poor beyond measure.
Right.
And yeah, you're in an emergency situation. Again, they imagine that this is the kind of situation when we're in the 1930s again. Again, we're not, because we don't have to build all the highways. We don't have the post-war society has already been built. So unless we're going to come up with a bunch of other concepts that are like a highway but more interesting, which I guess for some people is the Green New Deal.
Right.
And I think I'm interested in that, but I think any Green New Deal will require a radical departure from economics, because just as we said earlier, you don't want your public sector to be based upon consumerism, on consumers. Well, presumably then, once we change the underlying variables, once a bus, becomes a different kind of, maybe it just becomes a different kind of public transit. I don't know. We describe it differently.
Right.
Presumably that will affect the prevailing language of social description.
Right. But it's this assumption that buses just exist because they're a good idea that makes sense, and that they weren't a reflexive thing that, once you had cars and streets, we need an alternative. Not everyone in New York City needs to own a car. So you develop a subway. These are all reflexive, and we're all over-determined, in fact, by the economics of them. But now it's as if things like healthcare, buses, housing, et cetera, really just kind of exist out there, and everyone agrees that they all make sense. And
all we need is economics to come in as a science, the perfect science, to give us the right arithmetic or calculus.
Right. It's like kind of the worst in both cases. It's like they act as if these things weren't developed expressly because of and with economics in mind, and that the solution to them is more or better economics.
Though we should qualify that. Like, I don't think that buses were created by economics. I think that buses only make sense in an economic system, which is a little bit weirder. It means that if economics doesn't make sense, buses don't make sense. I'm not convinced buses in their modern sense make sense. I think that they're part of a social ideology. I think, it's very difficult to get at, like, what's the fundamental unit of reality? It's a philosophical question. Buses are not the fundamental unit of reality. I can assure you of that. But not only can I assure you of that, I can also tell you that, what it is it's a feedback process of economics and buses together. I mean, economics for me goes back, more than 500 years ago, to the beginnings of market society and the beginnings of what we call capitalism, generally somewhat vaguely, which means a society kind of based upon expanding commerce, using commerce as the basis for how states will be organized. So a new concept of trade is born. And then renegotiating the state to be based on the concept of revenue. You know what I mean? Which begins modern conflicts between taxation. I mean, taxation has always been a problem for thousands of years. It will always be a problem to take money from people. Yeah. But a new problem in that there was a conflict between money that was being made inside society versus money that was being collected by the state. Like, you get all of these weird problems that we consider eternal, but they emerge at a very particular historical juncture. And so does the bus, so does the public transit, so does healthcare. And I think that what we have to accept is that the healthcare that we have, universal healthcare in Canada, for instance, emerged at a particular historical juncture itself. And we're not going to get those historical conditions back, but we also have to appreciate that it was an extraordinary act of imagination on the part of the people who developed universal healthcare, responding to the conditions that they had, coming up with a great idea to respond to it. Are we going to do the same thing? I don't think that our situation is any less systematic than theirs. They had to say, no, we'll come up with this solution that will still work within market society, within market economics. That took a kind of courage.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not the courage ultimately we actually want, because we want something even more courageous. But there is this feedback process that sort of begets more social reality. But when you get to the end of that, to the core of this, and you look at economics, and it doesn't make sense. It's inconsistent. You will never its axioms will never be fully formalizable, will never fully make sense. You have to ask yourself some serious questions about the underlying society that you've built. Absolutely.
Right. Well, we have from Brain Rot Economist another great question, which is, in post-capitalist society, AI will replace the bus. And I think we've talked about that AI might not even mean post-capitalist. It may mean post-economics, in some ways, in the most nefarious way. That's the way that we're seeing it happen now. Everything just, as we often say, tilting towards the bottom. If you think that markets can't tell us what we need, man, AI is certainly not going to be able to. And if you think that we can't tell markets and we can't create these things, telling AI what we need necessarily. But AI, I think, will, as we've spoken a lot, undo a lot of economics, just as the internet and the digital undid and forced people to renegotiate, maybe unsuccessfully, the way that they sort of thought of really existing society. AI kind of throws it all into a crazy.
I think the internet is something we should talk about it because it could have done it really well. And I think it's still doing it, but we don't realize it. The sense in which AI could replace a bus is actually very simple to explain. I think it's a very ironic, slightly satirical question, but I'm going to
there is a little winky face.
I'm going to answer it in earnest, and I'm going to answer it. AI can absolutely replace a bus in that it will replace first of all, it'll replace your driver. Okay, well then I don't need a wage anymore.
Right.
Oh, so there's another axiom of economics gone. And et cetera. And you just go through, well, if AI is making the bus because they make things, because they do the programming, the manufacturing with robots, et cetera, et cetera. Like, many people are able to believe that this kind of technocracy is possible. It's just a matter of time before AI is making literally everything. So once you get that, and then you don't have a wage system, not only is economics questioned, but presumably all the things, again, that economics helps make sense to us. It's important to understand that economics, it creates a certain kind of information which we make use of. That's what it does. And the problem is that the things that we make with that information are also kind of pieces of information. The bus is a piece of information. It's a design. It has ideas of the human being put into it. The buses that didn't have spaces for disability people was a bus that not only lacked a fundamental piece of, say, our modern social reality, but therefore was a kind of bus that was not, didn't have the metaphor of disabled people in it.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, it sort of lacked a certain, and rather than it being a really existing improvement that makes a bus better, it's the informationality of the bus that is improved. When you include that disability space, it has nothing to do with a really existing disabled person or really existing disability space. It has to do with the structure that kind of emerges in social reality. And I think that once you get rid of a wage system, you're going to have some serious questions about what people are going to do. And I don't know if we can go back to a wage system. This is the interesting thing. And not only, this is not in the future, this is happening right now. In fact, Varoufakis talks all the time about how the governments of the world do not know how to tax Amazon, Alphabet,
right,
anyone. They don't know how to do taxes for these digital systems, for these digital platforms that operate with a new form of capital, etc. It's a huge, in fact, I mean, Varoufakis put a number on it. He's at 30% of GDP, which is a crazy number.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's insane.
If you want to know why all this is happening in New York City, this is the only number you should be looking at. How is it possible? And the really scary thing
let's qualify that. The 30% is how much people are paying in rent, basically, to these massive.
Yeah, how much the percentage of GDP that's going to pay? Yeah, exactly. The cost of having everything going through Amazon, YouTube, Google. So because we do so much commercial activity, so much of our lives, our social lives, et cetera. I mean, the major structures of a society play through these platforms.
Yeah.
We have to pay to use these platforms. And that payment comes in the form of rent, which is a very old concept that has made a return in a broader sense. But we're having a problem with taxing this stuff, which means the taxation system doesn't work in a increasingly digital society and an increasingly AI society, at least as far as if they want to use AI as the crutch. And I think that they do, because they're like, well, where are we going to get our productivity from? This is a very precise point. Like, the people who are building the digital society in the worst way, the Jeff Bezoses and so on, want productivity still. Oh, they want a kind of naive wage system. They want a tax system, but they're currently replacing those systems, right? The digital already kind of replaces them in a sense before we get to AI, but they still need productivity to support all kinds of forms of market power that gives them the leverage that they have politically.
This is the argument sometimes for AI, is when we talk about, AI will eliminate, XYZ jobs. People say, well, it'll eliminate bullshit jobs that no one wanted to do anyways, and that it will create jobs for prompt trainers and technicians and IT people and all these things. Oh, hey, look at that. Doesn't want me to talk. Hold on. We'll be back shortly. Okay. That's it. That's us. That's good. That's sometimes the argument for, well, AI is going to take your job. And it says, no, it's only going to replace your bullshit job that you already didn't want to do. And, instead of working at McDonald's, you'll become a prompt engineer, or you'll become someone who is a service technician on the robot that flips the burgers and all of these things. But once all of that flows into, no wage or no cost or no taxation, it's not even possible.
And here you can see again why the progressive economists are desperate to show us that economics is necessary. It's almost as if the progressive option is saying, against artificial intelligence, the digital, the things that are accelerating all of these sort of basic affordability paradigm problems, is to have good old-fashioned economics back. Right. Because if we have good old-fashioned economics, we have good oldfashioned society back. This is the illusion that's being sold to us by the progressives. Obviously, we're not in favor of the fucking AI BS society either. Sure. But I'm much angrier at the progressives, because they're supposed to be trying to do something interesting, new, and emancipatory. And basically selling us economics is not the way.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that was because the progressive approach to economics. I mean, literally Marx talks about it, but I think maybe 10 years ago when we had that kind of, we talk about it sometimes, like, when leftists all had hammer and sickles in their profile pictures, and everyone was we almost had the identity politics version of Marxism, where you were always a Marxist, blankest a million times over. Was people were talking a lot about that, fully automated luxury communism, luxury space communism, all of these things. And there was an idea that, we were going to maybe move beyond, I mean, perhaps regressively, but we were maybe going to move beyond market society because of things like AI and automation, that we're going to do away with the need for money. But now it seems even the progressives are saying, well, the way in which it will save us money will mean that we can, redistribute it. If there's no money that needs to pay someone to flip burgers at McDonald's because it's a robot, we'll be able to put that money into socialized healthcare or socialized housing or all these things.
Or their argument will be, no, don't get rid of the burger flipper.
Right.
No, I think that's more their argument. Don't get rid of the burger flipper. Don't use AI. We want old-fashioned productivity back because it's the only way our monetary system works. We don't want to go into that, journey to the end of the night,
right,
where we don't have a monetary system and AI runs everything. And you can see this is why for them it's an apocalypsis. It's a kind of revelation moment, because they're like, oh, no, we're not ready for the collapse of, not just, global institutions of trade and, the IMF, but the collapse of money itself. People are not ready for that. And I think, it's happening. It only ever worked very, very temporarily. Post-war economics was a particular brand of economics, a particular brand of society building and social reality.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's something else you said, though, that I forget.
What did I say?
I don't know. That's why I can't remember.
I don't know. I guess, yeah, for me.
Something else I wanted to respond to.
Well, as someone who's been a burger flipper, I'm happy for no one to ever have to do that job again. That's great. But what do they have for me to do if not flip the burger? And what,
Yeah, well, yeah. So this is the enduring illusion of fully automated luxury communism. Is they still actually have total productivity notions still there, like real concepts of productivity. Just getting our video back up. There it is. Real, like they still think that there's something productive that you will do. Or worse yet, this is even more schizophrenic. AI will be productive. No. Once AI is doing it, there's no such thing as productivity, in my opinion.
Right.
Unless you're still measuring it against human social reality. And, AI is a part of our everyday lives. But then you still have productivity, because whether or not the AI are doing well or doing poorly, right, like this visit to the doctor metaphor, that will determine everything else. Oh, and it'll be like the worst version than even Stalinism. Oh, AI is not doing well today. You don't get bread.
Right.
It'll be that kind of thing. In other words, you will not have escaped the productivity paradigm. Just fixing our buggy.
Yeah, sorry.
Buggy.
It just decides that it needs to shut down sometimes, and it's unclear as to why.
Yeah. So, and productivity is the issue to itself critique, the very paradigm. So, when you ask, what am I, say as an ex-burger flipper going to do instead? The question should be asked outside of any paradigm of productivity. You have to ask. I mean, you almost have to literally ask, what am I going to do? AI already has an answer, and it's not a pretty one. I think the real question we have to ask is, what will we do without AI? If we had to think about it, is this an improvement to our society or a desperate crutch without which we can't imagine or politically engage or talk to one another? It seems as if we're reaching that kind of point, and it was the exact same point that the internet was pushed to, right? That it would just be... that the internet would it's just become the ultimate solution for all of our mistaken operations in society. Question.
Good question here.
I think I know who Brain Rot Economist is, but shall I read it out? So two scenarios. This sounds,
I think, a lot like
Yuval Noah Harari, who has claimed that technology now will replace human labor very rapidly and could cause social collapse and disaster. While the taxation issue, tax havens and multinationals seem far more in line with Piketty's idea that we're now more or less headed for the 18th century, a world where investment in rent-generating assets instead of productive capital is more profitable, will lead to great stratification and social immobility. Yeah, well, I mean, Harari doesn't seem to address the much more Freudian problem that human labor will continue in the form of productivity, but it'll be productivity without human beings, which is a really strange contradiction. I don't see how we'll go back to the 18th century in any sense, even remotely, unless we're also going to start colonizing things and bringing back mercantile economics. And not least because Piketty doesn't have as usual, any room there for the digital, for the fact that this is a very specific form of rent control. And I'm also not convinced that there are rent-generating assets, because they're not assets. Assets presumes a form of capitalism in which you have designations of private property. These are not assets. They can be called platforms, or yes, you do have to be a little bit dramatic and use Varoufakis' term that they're fiefs, tech fiefs. What do you say to that, brain rot? Do you want to look at like Doomscroll a little bit?
Yeah, I was wondering if we should
in a shift from economics. We might might look at some. There's a guy named Jonathan Citarella.
Joshua, I think. Joshua.
You tell me.
We're doing.
Sorry,
Mr. Benelli.
Mr. Benelli. Joshua Citarelli, who runs the Doomscroll podcast.
Yes.
Who has for many years been a kind of what I can really call a kind of internet anthropologist.
Yeah.
Who's been trying to, and even in this interview, his most recent interviews with Francis Fukuyama, the end of history guy. Not sure if you can bring that up.
Yeah. Do we want to watch this, or do we want to address? Because there was one.
We'll just show it.
There was a clip that we really liked. Well, disliked, actually, strongly disliked, I should say. There was a clip that had us talking a lot about how his version of the sort of history of neoliberalism.
We can talk about that. That's a very complicated topic.
Yeah.
I think we might start with just Fukuyama because it's a little bit closer as well to the New York City issue.
Sure.
Because Citarella is interested in these kind of niche internet movements. And he even asks Fukuyama about what do you think about them. And Fukuyama gives the kind of, progressive, and I mean that in the worst sense, answer that, they're becoming very serious, so we need to take them seriously. They're getting bigger and bigger. I don't really know what they're referring to. Something about the alt-right or these kind of misinformation cliques. But yeah, I was sort of saying that Citarella, for me, also there's this problem of the gap again between what you study and the person who studies it, the student. It's like, to make an anthropology about humans, I think is impossible, which is ironic because, of course, anthro means human. It means study of the human being. But maybe it was possible when we had some of these more old-fashioned, dare I say, classifications about, there are not so developed societies.
Sure.
And Levi-Strauss would study them and came up with certain concepts of structure. I think that much of what Levi-Strauss holds, whether or not you have that kind of sort of racist distinction, I think there's something really to be said about structure as having this kind of divisional setup, whether or not you have but it's within the human being. But not to get lost in the weeds there, the point is that I think that anthropology is very, very difficult because you have to, Citarella influences, in a sense, what he studies, and not by actually sending the messages at the same time and then they sort of change their answers. That's a very interesting problem of traditional anthropology, how the other is responding to you, responding to them. It's also just true that I think that when you're studying the internet and you don't make a political decision, or when you're studying human beings and the objective knowledge that you're building doesn't involve a political decision and involved subjective political decision, I'm not sure you can actually call yourself objective. This is the weird paradox. Like, you have to make a political commitment first, from which then you see the evidence as you've arranged it. And this is something that a couple of philosophers have argued for in recent times, but it's really important. And what he does on this Doomscroll podcast, which I think is sort of the update to his original forms of anthropology, is to have all these experts on and, we're just constructing an objective knowledge of things.
Right.
We're just saying what's happening as if we're just good old-fashioned empiricists.
Right.
And I think this is really subversive in that in order to watch this, I don't have to make a political decision.
Yeah. Well, they have a weird, I think that they would admit they come at it from maybe a slightly leftist or progressive perspective.
Which we've just deconstructed. So.
Right, exactly. But that's what's always kind of striking about these is it's true. It's as if it's this kind of objective fact, although he does have a bunch of kind of weird people on.
But weird in this kind of pre-chewed, you're allowed to be weird sense of the internet clique. I'm not interested in Citarella's thesis at all about internet cliques, but that's where, the political movement of our time will eventually emerge. I not only think this is false, but I think it presents itself as a very dangerous form of ideology. So because it's already reified, the fact that people like Fukuyama can talk about it almost dismissively, because he's already integrated into his theories. Oh yeah, no, there are niche communities. We need to take them seriously because they're dangerous, And then Citarella will try to be like, but maybe they have something to say. And we have to come up with a kind of science that can include alternative viewpoints. It's like that in and of itself is the alternative viewpoint that clearly Fukuyama, I'm sure, is more than comfortable with agreeing to, but out of which nothing interesting political will emerge.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what what the thesis really posits necessarily. Like I've always been a little bit confused by this, where it's like they want to talk about the internet in this way that's like all of this crazy stuff is going on. Can you believe that there are trad cath Marxist Leninist whatever freaks who have these insane pastiche positions and all of these things, but that somehow it's both totally dismissible as like, oh, some weird cultural phenomenon, and yet worth studying, worth bringing an expert on, worth doing all this investigation into. I've always been like a little bit.
Well, the pretentious presumption is that you understand these people, that you do not have to make for them a politically engaged decision in order to understand them. I think in the context of many of the people that Citarella talks about, that's actually true. And for an interesting reason, because they're all organized by the internet.
Right.
This is the thing he seems to have understood, but won't fully raise to the level of like a proper political idea. The internet already does the anthropology for you. The very fact, this is the only insight of anthropology, or one of the more interesting ones. The fact that people are presented in front of you is basically the conclusion that you should write up in your research paper on them, because they're engaged in how they're presented. The thing that Levi-Strauss was able to negotiate with was people who were, say, outside of the West, outside of even global capitalism, as this massive phenomenon, who were completely in control of how they designated and presented themselves.
Right.
And therefore it became very difficult. But for that reason, Levi-Strauss is not really interesting as an anthropologist in the sense of the content that he produced as something as sort of validating anthropology. He was studied by philosophers and psychoanalysts because he had an insight into structure. He had an insight into presentation. He had an insight into appearance. Here's the thing about the internet, though. It already structures appearance, which means who cares what people actually say on it any more than, in commercial society, we don't particularly care what products go through as long as commerce, right, remains and we can continue to bankroll it and the monetary system continues to flow through. The question then is, what is the internet presenting everything as? So maybe to that extent you could go look at all these weird phenomena, but then maybe the only thing you would actually take serious note of would be, it seems like tons of positions are possible, one in a kind of incoherent way. So clearly we need to go back onto the internet and renegotiate, say, political institutionality or actual, say, political agency, because the internet can facilitate basically every identity, but it means nothing.
Right.
Unless you can structure the internet.
Right. Well, because the clip that we've spoken about is he speaks about neoliberalism, right? And he's like, neoliberalism is kind of the dominant, ideology of the past, since the 70s, basically. And the way that he presents it is he's like, but people forget that this was this really fringe group in the 40s or in the 50s or whatever, before pre-70s. And that, the idea of dismissing them as you would dismiss, the alt-right, it's like people dismissed the alt-right in 2014. And then by 2016, Trump is president. And people dismissed the neoliberals, or would have maybe dismissed the neoliberals. And now it's the dominant economic ideology. So when you hear about, anime, communist, racist, Catholics or whatever, you might think to dismiss them. But actually, they're really worth studying because they could become this insane whatever, Oftentimes these things that become totally mainstream start out as fringe, but I think there's some pretty key differences between something like.
I think we're narcissistically engaged in ourselves in trying to find that we still produce authentic differences, authentic social movements, authentic politics. I think this is all Citarella seems to sell. He sells us this comforting illusion that people are engaging in interesting and properly different social activities, which I don't think is true. I think the most interesting difference that has emerged is that of the internet. And we've not figured out the society for the internet. As for neoliberals, neoliberalism ended in 2008, kind of brutally, in my opinion. And it's been in a zombified form ever since. As for whether or not it was ever a kind of obscure group, well, it was this obscure group in the 1940s when they were trying to rebuild the global order. And a decision had been made more than a generation earlier, after the crash of 1929, to make a huge departure from economics, which saw things like subjective appraisal, which called marginalism, letting each person make a decision about whether an object is of value to them. In other words, removing any higher or central form of organization to the economy. Well, that collapsed in 1929 because for many people it led to the market crash, and you had the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression and eventually the war. So yes, by the time that they're having the Bretton Woods Conference, I'm not sure that they weren't neoliberals then. They were a mix of people. They were the Austrian School of Economics in particular, but eventually also the Chicago School under Friedman. And it's like, well, probably that was considered a very naive idea because it already existed. It already existed in the worst sense. It was already something that they had exercised not only as a political reality, but as an intellectual one. They had spent like several generations trying to figure out the mathematics for marginalism, and they never came up with it. And what eventually happened is that by 1971, when that post-war era broke down and you reached all these slowdowns, and suddenly there was an interest, in what's going to accelerate commercial activity if it's not going to be post-war growth, what was called neoliberalism became popular again, or what's called in economics neoclassical economics. But it was never, by the time it became popular again, I mean, let's not underestimate that the Austrian School of Economics basically recognized all of the critiques of the mathematics of marginalism that people like Sraffa and various others had developed, and said, so therefore there can be no central planning of anything because we cannot figure it out mathematically, how to have a price system, basically. So therefore, we're anti-government. Well, then you should also be anti-market because therefore no market can also ever figure out a price system, which was the conclusion. Not of people like Sraffa and Keynes. Sraffa and Keynes then said, we need a massive social organization because markets literally, mathematically, theoretically and conceptually do not work. Obviously, this was considered to be the wrong move for people like von Hayek and Friedman. And to an extent, they're right to critique Sraffa and Keynes. I would join them in their critique of them, but I certainly wouldn't become a libertarian Austrian economist as a response or as a result. That would just be a total contradiction. So yeah, Citarella is definitely trying to resurrect, I think, some false differences here, that people were obscure who really weren't, or that this sort of plethora of positions on the internet is independent of the internet. There's a contradiction here. I don't understand.
Well, that almost seems to be perhaps the only kind of political choice that he does make in some cases, right? As he's like, this is a real thing. This is really what I study, is these niche groups that have a massive impact, and this is like a form that I've seen throughout history and that I can study and that is real. And here's some examples, and I need to find these examples. And it's kind of like, but it's almost a willful misreading of, it's almost like this is the alt-right. Oh, you know what? Actually, the neoliberals took the same form as the alt-right, pre-internet, pre-whatever. And it's kind of like, it almost seems like a deliberate, like it's like a retroactive misreading through your new thesis that proves your thesis. That is kind of just not, it's just like bad history.
But it could be good history if your politics was, let's have an internet society. Yeah. Then you could go back and retroactively resignify everything, and I'd have absolutely no problem with it. The problem is that right now the internet is not working. Yeah. Far from it producing all of these interesting social differences, I don't think the internet as the agora is working very well right now. Yeah. So I think he's right that there's some kind of, the marketplace, not in the sense of a commercial marketplace in the capitalist sense, but the people meeting and ideas and so on. Well, that's happening. Right. But it's happening in the worst sense. It's happening, the same way that after, the plague, people went hysterical because there was like the first example of wage inflation, Wow. Israel equals Nazi Germany.
Well, that's a big shift from what we were discussing. Doza Gaming, Israel equals Nazi Germany. Yeah.
I don't agree. Sorry.
Yeah.
You have to explain what you mean. But of course, it's not really Israel. It says Israel equals Nazi Germany.
Well,
I feel like if we say anything about this, it'll get, not that we're popular enough, but it'll get clipped. And saying the words Israel equals Nazi Germany was already a mistake.
Yeah, that is very true. That is very true. Yeah, and it's unclear which side would get upset at us. I think that we have I would like to imagine, a fairly nuanced take on that situation.
Well, we can talk about Israel if we want. It's not that, the Israel-Iran war has obviously begun in its most hysterical phase. I don't think that there's anyone except Israel who is interested in supporting this war.
Right.
The Americans they're not even interested in supporting Israel anymore. That should tell you everything about how Israel is basically a rogue state. Some people have even said that Israel is a failed state.
Oh no.
Oh yeah.
We're already on TikTok.
That's brain rot.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
In any event, they've gone rogue. They've completely gone rogue.
Totally.
And here are the choices, right? Genocidal maniacs and using propaganda very similar to that's similar to the United States as well. It's similar to Canada to some extent, the residential schools.
Totally.
Unfortunately, the structure of politics nowadays is in the form of genocide and propaganda. It's been true for centuries. In fact, it's even true in Roman times. So the state is defined in terms of genocide and propaganda. So perhaps your critique should be with the state and not necessarily with Israel as such or her most recent actions. In fact, the scary thing is that Israel might agree with you. I don't think Israel is interested in the state at all, which means that probably, Doza, you're more likely to find yourself agreeing with the Israelis than you are disagreeing with them, and that you're a post-liberal. But actually coordinating the political revolution of post-liberalism will take a little bit more thinking than just Israel equals Nazi Germany. Any thoughts?
Yeah, we're interested. We're definitely interested to hear what you have to say.
Well. Well, the genocide they commit, simply put, is Nazism. I don't understand.
Yeah, this is difficult. Well, Nazism was a very, very specific thing, and so it's not exactly the same. But I understand. I totally understand the parallels. I don't think we're advocates of what Israel is doing.
I don't understand. No, I'm sorry. I don't understand the parallels at all. I don't see any relationship between. I mean, what the Nazis did in the Holocaust, it's worse than a genocide. Much worse than a genocide. You know. And I think that probably what's happening in Gaza right now is worse than a genocide. It's not just about the famine. It's not just about the massacring. It's worse than that. It's about the collapse of a state in the Middle East. But here's the problem. Do you want to support Trump and go on a Gulf state visit and negotiate $1 trillion in military deals with the Saudis and get them to recognize the state of Israel?
Right.
So that you can then come up with a coherent solution for Gaza with Saudi Arabia and Israel finally on the same side? I don't think you want that either. So the two options we have right now are horrible. Support Israel in its roguishness. Okay, terrible.
Yeah.
Or support the pan-Middle East, politically stamped by Donald Trump with $1 trillion of AI and military technology deals. This is terrible.
Yeah.
Aside from the target victims, what are the real differences between the occupation of Palestine and this war and the Holocaust? I think the more interesting question is the one I'm trying to put, which is the choice about getting out of this. And this should affect how we describe Israel, right? Do you describe Israel as a genocider or as a rogue state? Well, I can tell you right now that describing Israel as a rogue state is much more interesting, much more effective politics. I'm not sure it's interesting to say of a state that it does genocide. You know what? I'll go even a step further. I'm not sure it's interesting to say of a state that they commit holocausts. I think maybe this might just be what states do. They commit Holocaust, which is why in the post-war era, everyone's hysterical reaction to Nazism was, how do we make a state without making a state? How do we have nationalism without nationalism?
Right.
Bear in mind that the Nazis were the ultimate extension of the nationalist movements of the 19th century, all of which were liberal phenomena. They were based upon an emancipation of the human being who can join a kind of radically, sort of circle of radical equals. Why the nation state was nonetheless a part of that is one of the great contradictions of the 19th century. But yeah, how you describe Israel matters, and I think you should see it as a rogue state because it allows you to also criticize the bad alternatives. Trump right now, Trump wants to solve Gaza. He wants to help the Gazans. He wants to stop Israel shooting left, right, and center. But that isn't, I don't think that you're a Trump supporter. Right. I don't think, Doza, that you're trying to be a Trump supporter. So calling it a rogue state means that it's a complexity even for the Americans, and the Americans do not have a solution. It's not $1 trillion in military technology and AI deals with the Saudis. It's not the answer, But if you boil down, then Israel is a terrorist state, which is the little brother of the bigger terrorist. That's better. It's working.
Totally.
We're getting better.
Totally.
Because how do you deal with something like compliance with American interests? What's really scary is that Israel historically actually tends to tell America what to do, because Israel is so important for the United States. And this was no less true than right now, the fact that basically it seems as if Trump was completely blindsided by Netanyahu's decision to bomb preemptively Iran. But yeah, I mean, do we describe America now as a bigger terrorist? Well, I think the idea is, what does peace in the Middle East look like? Is it a stabilization based upon $1 trillion of military and AI technology deals? I don't think so. I'm not sure. Yeah. In my opinion, I don't think the answer is actually what the left has to say about Palestine. I'll be completely real with you.
Sure.
I don't think the state should be part of the discussion. Palestine is an opportunity to think beyond the liberal state. Great. Isn't that the emancipatory opportunity right now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that anyone who's living in, even what we would consider, some of the best states for quality of life in the world, which are, Canada, where we are, the idea that it's something that we talk about all the time. With this is part of the failure of immigration sometimes, right? Is that people come from, in our case, India, Bangladesh, whatever, they come to Canada, and then Canada is still terrible. The quality of life, the freedom, the way that you can imagine yourself or exist is very, very limited. So as much as we're in favor of a free Palestine, the idea that means a state which is absorbed into the neoliberal order, or the zombified version of the neoliberal order,
or a state.
Or a state.
I'm not interested in a state.
A state at all is, I would describe, anyways.
Well, I don't think this was an attempt to help him negotiate a nuclear deal. I actually think it's because a nuclear deal might have actually possibly succeeded under a Trump, though it's impossible to say, absolutely impossible to say, that Netanyahu said, oh no, the Americans are working well, possibly with Iran and the Saudis.
Right.
Well, we can't have this. That was the reaction of Netanyahu. He was saying we cannot have. So even Netanyahu is responding to $1 trillion of deals. Even Netanyahu doesn't want that to exist. Again, that should not make one a supporter of Netanyahu. But you have to understand that there are conflicts even within power itself. But let's just address this. Historically, America has never been the good guy in a war. I would describe that as terrorism if we never have a good reason to go shoot children in the Middle East. I'm not entirely sure grammatically what's going on. But I don't know what to say.
Well, I mean, this is sort of I think what gets back to the sort of concept of a state is that, is there a good guy? Is there a good guy in any war ever? Is war ever good? Is there ever a good reason to shoot children in the Middle East? Is there ever a good reason to shoot children anywhere? I don't think so.
But what's even scarier, can I just say, what's even scarier is that, the solution that leftists want for Palestine right now is a state based entirely on liberal foundations, therefore a state that can have a good commercial democracy. This is the horseshoe intersects.
Yeah.
I mean, what the left wants for Palestine seems to be precisely the entity that engages in genocide.
Yeah.
So right now it's a problem of imagination. Netanyahu doesn't know what to do. Trump wants his Middle East Riviera. Is the left going to come up with a better idea? I think the problem is everyone's against genocide, which is why the Israelis can kind of escape, propagandistically the question of genocide, because they can always say, oh, we're against genocide, because the liberal order, the post-war liberal order, was based upon a response to the Holocaust.
Right.
No more so than in the case of Israel. So it might seem very polemical to say, oh, but Israel was based upon a response to the Holocaust. So therefore, shouldn't they be the most implicated? Shouldn't they be the most implicated when they commit genocide? On the contrary, they're the most entitled in their mind to say, oh, but of course we can't commit genocide because we're the response. We're the liberal post-war response to the Holocaust. Clearly they're not. Clearly the post-war response was not good enough. Clearly, I regret to say it, but any nation state built in the image of 19th century liberalism will run into the paradoxes that all states have run into. Of whether or not you can have a national identity in a liberal commercial society. Aren't those things supposed to be opposites? which America has always been the true attack. There are no reasons valid enough to go shoot children. Me, but God knows. America will tell you what they're doing is God's will. America will always find a reason to go shoot. Sure, I don't know if we disagree. The question is why is America compelled to engage in this kind of brazen, murderous Middle East politics? Is it because they're all so racist? I think it's much worse than racism. Something much deeper than racism. It's something I think that we're all probably susceptible to as citizens of the liberal nation state, if I'm to be particularly radical. But therefore, why are we saying Palestine get a state? We have to imagine something more interesting than a state for Palestine. What do you say to that, Doza? What's your solution? What's the proper progressive leftist solution for the war in Gaza? Maybe there are good reasons why the two-state solution didn't work, because it's a bad solution. I don't think anybody believes that the war right now is a good solution except Netanyahu's war cabinet, who want to use war to help Netanyahu avoid every possible accusation under the sun that he's been given. He is not liked anymore. In fact, Israelis are extremely tired of Netanyahu as well. Israelis basically are like, oh my gosh, this strategy for bringing back the hostages has completely failed. Yeah. You know what I mean? I think when it becomes a question about Jewish identity and the integrity and validity of Jewish identity, people will get particularly sensitive, and that's understandable, I think. But what's your solution to the rogue state, or to statism, to statesmanship? You know.
Do we want to shift at all?
Sure. When we wait, if Doza responds, we'll respond.
Okay.
We've also lost.
Oh, God, it's really frustrating. I literally have no idea. That's my only good hypothesis is that.
Yeah, we were meant to talk more about Fukuyama. I think what I wanted to talk about was the abundance stuff that Fukuyama mentions.
Sure. Well, we can.
If you want to play
the Overton window.
Oh no, that's horrible. It's so needless. Let's talk about abundance, because abundance is related to the New York thing. So if you go to when you ask him a question about the Democratic Party, it's later in the video, about 44 minutes in or so.
Post-liberalism and oligarchy, identity politics and inner self.
No.
What the fuck is this? Abundance
in
2028. Okay, let's go to this.
Yeah.
Okay, give me a sec. Oh, and we've lost. Oh my God. It's also very inconsistent.
Okay.
So we'll go to just a little bit before.
It doesn't matter.
What do you envision that the Democrats could offer in 2028 to defeat this Trumpism?
Good. All right, I was waiting for that
I've
question.
been working up to it.
Like I'm really all on board the abundance movement. Ezra Klein's.
I had a feeling. Okay.
Yeah. I've been really interested in infrastructure for some years now, and it's been one of my kind of big research topics, because it's really striking that we don't build stuff anymore. High-speed rail, the failure to roll out rural internet, high-speed internet. There's just a whole bunch of things that, don't happen that really ought to be happening. And I think that Ezra is right in the sense that this is actually the fault of progressives, because what progressives have done is to believe that legitimacy lies in procedures, and therefore to legitimize something, you need to add more layers of procedures, to the point where it gets really hard to actually do things like build transmission lines. So right now, the major producers of alternative energy in the United States are Texas and Oklahoma, these two deep red states. And the demand for that is in California, and you can't build transmission lines to get that electricity from the middle of the country to where it's needed, because
we don't want to talk about Texas and Oklahoma. It's a whole other topic, though it is, of course, one part of Klein's whole account. But I mean, for me, this is such a strange, perhaps predictable position that Francis Fukuyama would say, no, the slowdowns in infrastructure don't have to do with our concepts of infrastructure, don't have to do with market society or market capitalism, but have to do with progressive procedural policy. I'm no fan of progressive procedural policy. It goes back to our critique of progressive economics at the beginning of the stream. It's bad thinking. We're not going to solve this by adding more layers of procedure, but that procedure was there because it has this fantasy, again, that if we can stabilize certain social goals, we can get our monetary system back.
Right.
Right. If we can have a functional wage system again, for which we need good social goals, if we remove, abject consumerism and commercialism, we can get our monetary system back. We can get good old-fashioned economics back. This is what the fantasy of all this proceduralism has been. It's been a very bad fantasy. I agree with Fukuyama on that point. But it's the worst argument in that it has this terrible misreading, which is a total conservative misreading, right? A misreading of it's been the roadblocks, the frustrations to commercial society, as if commercial society has not had fewer roadblocks than ever to operate. The problem is that commercial society needs interruptions in the most perverse sense in order to generate the minimal amount of commercial data and or information on the basis of which human beings can actually make coherent decisions. Without that, again, you're doing AI. You're not in a coherent world. So this abundance movement with Ezra Klein is...
I'm not really familiar.
It's just, if Fukuyama summarizes it perfectly. In fact, that last example about Texas and Oklahoma is exactly, again, the example that Ezra Klein and his co-author want to discuss. How is it possible that the conservatives are doing clean energy? Well, maybe it's because when you do dirty energy, it's actually really easy to do clean energy. It's also the same thing in Alberta.
Right.
Alberta's also the capital for clean energy in Canada. It's not necessarily that interesting. There are tons of procedural issues to an extent in Alberta, but I don't think this is the point. I don't want to negotiate this because this will become a factual dispute about differences in relative differences in policy and procedure. The point is about abundance is they can revive the Democratic Party's prospects by searching for, abundance. Let's do Trump's bring back manufacturing, but let's do the Democratic Party's version of it.
Right.
I have no idea how they're going to do it. I mean, they are abject neoliberals, the Democratic Party. They believe in globalization to the max. They're like the Europeans. The only way that the European neoliberals have figured it out is militarism, military Keynesianism. And in fact, we have to discuss this, Ontario, too, is interested now in replacing their auto sector with defense sector contracts.
Right.
Oh, so this is the solution to the Trump trade war, i.e., the abundance for Europe and Canada will be militarism, which is a crazy idea for how to negotiate abundance. The Democratic Party absolutely will do militarism as well. They are the party of endless wars. And in fact, many people have criticized them for this, but yeah.
Right. Well, this is, again, what gets us back to our kind of discussion of progressive economics is that, again, the solutions that they find to these problems are so reaffirming of the structures that cause the problems that it's almost, it's very shocking. The idea that, well, we had this market society that was based on automotive manufacturing, but NAFTA screwed over automotive manufacturing, or we accidentally made manufacturing so productive that it made sense to move it to Mexico and we lost all these jobs, whatever. But if we turn all those car factories into, F-35 factories or tank factories or whatever, this is our solution. This is how we...
The idea of the solution is that we'll also rewrite global borders and we'll recreate a global trade system. Not on the basis of consumerism, but on the basis of effort that citizens will put in through their effort in a war effort. Mm-hmm. Right? It won't be me buying things in the same way. It'll be me recognizing that I need to contribute to the war effort. So this is kind of they'll synthesize global trade through abject and accelerated militarism. It's like a crazy idea of how to sustain economic ways of thinking. At all costs. I mean, it's also true. They don't want to work without the informational variables that they have. They don't want to work. They don't want to come up with a better concept of healthcare or a wage system or a two-state solution. Sorry, it's not going to work. They've tried for decades. Very, very brilliant people have tried at a two-state solution, at least at the advocacy level. The fact that the Americans are frustrated, the fact the Israelis are frustrated, the fact that the Palestinians have frustrated it. Says certain things, maybe because, again, a state is not going to satisfy the emancipatory project of Palestine. At the moment, a state is not good enough for Netanyahu. And so, yeah, when you get to the Democratic Party's abundance platform, I think it's an attempt to kind of have their own version of Trumpianism. They haven't introduced an obvious or explicit layer of militarism, but that's because they're already a party of military action and endless war. So it remains to be seen, but definitely abundance is not, I think, is a fruitless endeavor.
Yeah.
To say the least. Okay.
I think we're good to end. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thanks so much for your questions. We really appreciate it. Genuinely. This was awesome. This was super fun. I think we're definitely going to keep this up. Next time, I'll figure out the webcam better. Won't turn off every 5 seconds.
Thank you for your questions.
Thanks so much for tuning in. The questions are awesome.
Thank you to Doza Gaming, Brainrot Economist, and
Helena.
Yeah, and Helena Contish.
Yes. Awesome.
I appreciate your questions. We appreciate the debate.
Yeah,
in
really
particular,
fun.
and the discussion.
Really awesome. Okay, well,
even if we disagree with you guys completely.
But that's okay. That's what we're here for. That's what we like. Okay, thank you so much. We'll be heading off now.